So in Chapter 17, we'll look at government budgets and fiscal policy. We'll talk about government spending, taxation systems here in the US at least, how federal deficits and national debt relate to the economy. We'll look at expansionary and contractionary fiscal policies. So before we talked about monetary policies by the Federal Reserve, now we're talking about fiscal policies by the national government, federal government. And we'll look at something called automatic stabilizers, some problems with discretionary fiscal policy where policymakers have to meet and vote and make decisions, and the effects of a balanced federal budget and the effects of a budget deficit on an economy. So if you were to look at the total federal spending, it runs between 18 to 22% for most of the years between 1960 and present. So roughly you can think of it as about 20% of the economy or GDP. So one in every $5 is spent by the federal government. And you'll see some of the big areas that it's spent on here: national defense, social security payments to the elderly, health care, usually in the form of Medicare and Medicaid for those who are elderly and disabled, and interest on loans. And you see how that's been going up to about 5% by the end of this graph's timeline, which is 2010. So in general, the three big areas are national defense, social security, and healthcare for federal government spending. This does not take into account state and local government spending. All other than the national government spending are on other things like education, social programs, infrastructure, highways, national parks, research grants and research work that the government is involved in, etc. So about 71% goes out to four major areas of that: national defense, social security, healthcare, and then interest payments on borrowing. So if you don't address one of those four areas, you're already saying, when you're trying to think through budget changes for the federal government, you're giving up 71 cents of every dollar is to those four things. So if you leave them off the table for discussion, then it's a much smaller part of the whole that you can make decisions about. Also, we see that state and local government spending has increased, and it's moved from about 10% of GDP to another 15% roughly. And so if we were to combine the two, 35 or over a third of our spending is government related spending. And one big area that they spend on is education, but you see the growth has in total spending at state and local levels has outpaced a little bit the way it increases and separates a little further from education. So where do governments get their money from? Here in the US, and we're going to talk exclusively about the US, this can be slightly different in other countries. You have an excise tax, which is one of the least familiar. That's this bottom line. That's a duty on manufacturer's goods, which could be set to the manufacturer. It could be collected at the point of sale from a retailer, or even both. So that's a small piece, but it's an important piece of how they collect some taxes. There are corporate taxes, and that's under much debate between the political parties on whether we should raise or decrease taxes on corporations. There's payroll taxes, which you may not be aware of this, but in addition to your individual income tax right here, so in addition to your individual income tax, that dotted line right here, that red dashed line, there's payroll taxes, things like your payment into Social Security, your payment for workers' compensation, and your employer also pays additional taxes on top of what you're charged out of your paycheck. I like to say it this way: when I employed people, I'd hire you at $20 an hour. And for that privilege, I'd end up paying $22 an hour and you'd end up receiving 15. So you feel like you got 15. I told you I'd pay you 20 and it really cost me 22. And that's partly because I have some payroll taxes that are above and beyond what I'm paying you. And then this is the total of all of those together. The tax receipts, politicians like to say they're going to go down while increasing services, which is hard to keep doing. One way of categorizing types of taxation are on how they impact and how they're impacted by changes or relative to our particular income. So a regressive tax is an income paid tax that's based on a percentage, and as you earn more and more money, um, it actually feels like a lower tax to you. So sales tax is a good example. Everyone pays 8% on everything they buy, but I don't necessarily have to buy a lot more just because I earn more. So you only pay it if you purchase things, and so the less you earn, the higher that 8% feels like as a percentage of your total income going out to sales tax. Progressive tax actually goes up as you earn more, and that's how the US federal income tax works. So that if you're in a low tax bracket, you might pay 10 or 15% of your income. If you're in a higher tax bracket, you might pay 18 or 20% of your income into federal taxes. And so the more you make, the higher that percentage goes. That's a progressive tax. And then there's a proportional tax that stays the same percentage regardless of what your income is, whether it goes up or down. For example, the Medicare payroll tax is the same percentage for everyone. So you've got regressive, progressive, and proportional taxes. The budget of the federal government here in the United States has been running a deficit. They spend more than they earn. They spend more than what they take in taxes, and have for most years since the 1970s, with some small exception here in the late 90s and early 2000s, where we got back to a balanced and actually surplus budget for a time. Today in 2020, we would see in 2019, we would see some pretty significant deficit spending. And part of that is that recessions and wars and pandemics tend to require spending money that no one foresaw needing, and therefore you didn't have the income to match those expenses. Building a bigger and bigger deficit, and you can go out and you can look up the deficit time clock and watch it going up in rapid formation. It's a little dizzying to watch. It is more of a concern to me if our economy is not growing. And so this graph really looks at comparing the federal debt as just a percentage of our total economy, and it's been fairly stable, if you will. If I were to draw a line right here around 80%, but it's dipped down below 30% and gone well over that 80% to even above 100% of GDP in the last 70, 80 years. And right now, we're in a situation similar to this trajectory, where the federal debt as a percentage of GDP, because we actually expect GDP to shrink for the first time in many years in 2020 due to the pandemic, that it will keep climbing. But if we can keep this number somewhat stable in this range, then the deficit isn't really any harder to manage, because it's the same percentage of our total economy. This is quite a variation over an 80-year period. And what we see is a divergence between tax receipts, the red dotted line, and total spending, and they're moving in directions where we keep spending money we haven't taken in taxes and trying to find ways to spur the economy to grow it without by not raising taxes. Discretionary fiscal policy has to do with debates and passing of legislation and decisions made by government. And an example of that in 2009, the bailout of companies, the purchasing of treasury bills and company stocks and bonds, and even student loan debt, and raising the debt ceiling. Those were all things that Congress had to vote on and pass. Otherwise, they wouldn't happen without a explicit decision. Automatic stabilizers, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, try to smooth out business cycles of up and down, and they happen automatically without policymakers, politicians having to meet and make a decision because they've already put this into law and practice. So, for example, unemployment insurance. As soon as someone is unemployed, whether that's 3% of the population like it was in 2019, or whether that's more like 9% of the population, which it is currently as I'm talking with you, the unemployment insurance payments kick in automatically for households. We don't have to vote. Are we going to keep giving these? Do we give them now that there's more people unemployed or less people unemployed? And then the progressive tax bracket is another one. It automatically, your tax will increase as you earn more. It will decrease as you earn less. So if you're someone who's gotten a promotion, you'll end up paying more tax. If you're someone who your job was furloughed or you were cut to part-time, your taxation will automatically drop. Those are not things that anyone has to vote on. They happen automatically to help stabilize the economy as a whole. So when governments borrow money, what we see is governments then put a demand on that currency because they're saying we need more of it. That raises the demand, and ultimately that should increase both the supply of money in the market and the cost, when the cost of money is really the interest rate paid for getting that borrowing, and it's an expansionary policy. When governments begin to spend and it replaces other private spending, whether that's households or companies, the term is called crowding out. And that can happen directly where government spends money on goods or services that households used to buy privately. Like we build a new library and people no longer buy as many books from bookstores online or locally. It can happen indirectly, so government borrows for spending on new infrastructure, and as a result, there's a decrease in loanable funds for private investments in new homes or new expanded places to make products or deliver services. The time lag that happens between a decision or a policy when it is implemented and when we actually see the impact of it is called a time lag. And it happens for various reasons, but the amount of time to recognize that there's a problem in the economy that's not minor and short-lived that we need to do something can take some time. So before we even start to act and put the policy in place, because we haven't recognized the problem immediately, there's legislative time lags because government has to debate and pass legislation, and sometimes that's smooth, sometimes that's difficult as there's disagreement between parties and politicians. And then finally we have to implement whatever that policy change was, and that can take some time. Balanced budgets can be really good, and an argument for them, it prevents governments from large deficit spending that can get them in major trouble over periods of time. It can keep then national debt from overwhelming the economy as it has in Greece in recent history and other parts of the world. It also can keep government power in check by limiting its ability to spend, not letting it have too much power over the amount of spending if they're forced, much like the German government has stronger restrictions on spending above what they've been able to bring in revenue. There are reasons against a balanced budget too. Keynesian policy says that it's part of the federal government's role to lean against the wind. And what you want is you want to allow for automatic stabilizers to work to smooth out those fluctuations. And that if we have to push for a balanced budget, we will actually increase the number of business cycles, the ups and downs that we experience. So there will be more volatility. It also can limit long-term capital investment. So sometimes when a government's borrowing, it's really to make the future better, much like borrowing to go to college, I would say is an investment in yourself. The government can borrow to build the infrastructure we need to be successful tomorrow, or make the investments in research and development that we need to be successful tomorrow. So if they can only spend what they have, they might not be able to make the kind of investments in that research and development or infrastructure that we would want or need to compete on a world scale. And specific needed spending because of unique circumstances like World War II, like a pandemic. So your exercise for this chapter is to go out and look at tax rates. So there's some information about where tax rates used to sit back in 2016. They change under transitions in presidents quite often, and so we'll probably see a shift in 2020 coming up in what tax rates look like. But you can do a little research at this website and then look at a ranking of happiest countries in the world. I've given you one site here, and I want you to just compare, list the 10 happiest countries, and then kind of look at what their tax rates are and see if there's a direct relationship. Does having low tax rates make you likely to be happier? Does having high tax rates make you likely to be happier? Or are they not really clearly related? And then you can respond to the question at the bottom. Look forward to hearing your thoughts and seeing where all the happy places are in the world. So that might help you think about where you want to live.